Liquidated your mother's inheritance for our honeymoon resort. My new bride loves luxury. The text message glowed on my phone screen like a slap across the face. Below it, photos of my husband Troy and his 25-year-old secretary Bethany lounging on pristine Hawaiian beaches filled my screen. They were sipping colorful drinks with tiny umbrellas, her diamond ring catching the sunset light, a ring that cost more than most people's cars, paid for with money that should have been mine. My name is Karen Walsh, and I'm 47 years old. For 23 years, I believed I was married to a loving husband who supported my career as a cybersecurity specialist at Velwyn Digital in Phoenix, Arizona. I had spent decades building firewalls, designing security protocols, and ironically, protecting companies from the very kind of digital theft my husband had just committed against me. The inheritance he mentioned so casually in his text wasn't just money. It was the last connection I had to my mother, who had passed away 6 months earlier after a long battle with cancer. I set my phone down with trembling hands, staring at the modest apartment I now called home after Troy had kicked me out of our house 3 weeks ago. He had served me divorce papers the same day he announced his engagement to Bethany, claiming I was too focused on work and emotionally unavailable. What he didn't mention was that he had been planning this betrayal for months, systematically transferring assets and liquidating accounts while I was consumed with caring for my dying mother. The irony wasn't lost on me that the man who had accused me of being cold and calculating had orchestrated the most calculated betrayal I could imagine. While I was holding my mother's hand in her final moments, Troy was apparently planning his new life, with a woman barely older than our daughter would have been, if we'd had children. The inheritance, nearly $200,000 that my mother had saved through a lifetime of careful budgeting, was supposed to help me rebuild after the divorce. Instead, it was funding Troy's romantic getaway with his new bride, a woman who giggled at his jokes and called him daddy in a way that made my skin crawl. As I scrolled through more photos of their tropical paradise, something dark and determined settled in my chest. Troy thought he was clever, thought his basic understanding of banking and legal loopholes made him untouchable. But he had forgotten one crucial detail about his soon-to-be ex-wife. I didn't just work in cybersecurity. I was one of the best in the business. And unlike him, I actually understood how money moved in the digital age, how accounts could be traced, and more importantly, how they could be manipulated. He had made the mistake of underestimating me, and that oversight was about to become very, very expensive for him. My relationship with Troy hadn't always been this toxic battlefield of betrayal and manipulation. We met in college when I was studying computer science, and he was pursuing business administration. Back then, he seemed charming and ambitious, talking about building a future together where we'd both be successful in our respective fields. He supported my decision to specialize in cybersecurity, even bragging to friends about having a tech genius for a girlfriend. The early years of our marriage were genuinely happy. Troy started his own consulting firm, Mitchell & Associates, while I climbed the ranks at various tech companies before landing my dream job at Velwyn Digital. We complemented each other well, his people skills and my technical expertise. When clients needed both business strategy and digital security, we sometimes worked together, and those collaborations felt like the best parts of our partnership. But somewhere along the way, Troy's attitude toward my success shifted. What had once been pride became resentment. He started making subtle comments about how I spent too much time playing with computers, and not enough time being a real wife. When I received promotions or recognition for my work, he'd find ways to diminish the achievement, suggesting I only succeeded because companies needed to fill diversity quotas or because my male colleagues wanted to sleep with me. The warning signs were there, but I was too busy to notice them fully. When my mother was diagnosed with cancer last year, Troy seemed supportive at first. He encouraged me to take time off to care for her, even offering to handle our finances while I was distracted. I was grateful for his help and didn't question why he was suddenly so interested in managing our bank accounts and investment portfolios. During my mother's final months, I noticed Troy working late more frequently, claiming he had new clients who demanded evening meetings. He started paying more attention to his appearance, buying expensive clothes and hitting the gym religiously. When I asked about it, he said he needed to look professional for potential investors. I trusted him completely, never suspecting that his new investor meetings were actually dates with Bethany. The most painful part wasn't even the affair. It was realizing how meticulously he had planned my downfall. While I was grieving and vulnerable, he was consulting lawyers, moving money, and preparing for a life that didn't include me. He had used my mother's illness as cover for his theft, knowing I was too emotionally drained to monitor our finances carefully. Now, sitting in my small apartment with evidence of his Hawaiian honeymoon filling my phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: clarity. The fog of grief and shock was lifting, replaced by the sharp focus that had made me successful in my career. Troy thought he had outmaneuvered me, but he had made a crucial error. He had forgotten that behind every great cybersecurity specialist was someone who understood exactly how to exploit weaknesses in systems and people. His arrogance and greed had created vulnerabilities I was uniquely qualified to exploit. The devastating realization hit me like a physical blow when I finally logged into my laptop and began tracing the financial trail Troy had left behind. What I discovered made his text message seem almost quaint in its cruelty. The inheritance theft wasn't just about $200,000. It was part of a much larger, systematic looting of everything we had built together over 2 decades. Using my cybersecurity skills, I tracked the movement of funds across multiple accounts, each transfer timed precisely to coincide with my mother's medical appointments or overnight hospital stays. Troy had been planning this heist for at least 8 months, carefully moving money in amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, but large enough to devastate our shared assets. The inheritance was just the final piece of his puzzle. He had liquidated my retirement fund, cashed out our joint investment accounts, and even took a second mortgage on our house, all using forged documents bearing my signature. The man I had trusted with my financial future had stolen approximately $600,000 from me while I was watching my mother die. But the cruelest discovery came when I accessed our old email accounts. Troy had been corresponding with Bethany for over a year, and their exchanges revealed the true depth of his betrayal. They hadn't just been planning their affair. They had been planning their entire future using my money. Bethany's emails were full of excited chatter about the house they would buy, the trips they would take, and the business they would start together, all funded by what she cheerfully referred to as Karen's nest egg. In one particularly nauseating exchange, Troy had written, "Don't worry about the money, baby. She's so buried in code and caring for her sick mom that she doesn't even check the accounts anymore. By the time she realizes what's happening, we'll be married and living in Hawaii. What's she going to do? Hack us?" They had both found this hilarious, judging by the laughing emojis that followed. That last line echoed in my head as I sat in the darkness of my apartment, the glow from my laptop screen illuminating my face. What's she going to do? Hack us? Troy had meant it as a joke, a dismissive laugh at the idea that his computer nerd ex-wife could pose any real threat to their carefully planned paradise. He was about to find out exactly what I could do. I spent the rest of the night documenting everything, creating an irrefutable digital trail of Troy's theft. But evidence gathering was just the beginning. Over the years, I had developed certain capabilities in my cybersecurity work, tools and techniques that existed in legal gray areas, methods that were theoretically for defensive purposes, but could be repurposed for more aggressive applications. Troy thought he was clever, but he had made the fatal mistake of underestimating the woman he had betrayed. He wanted to know what I could do? I was about to show him the difference between stealing money and facing someone who could make that money disappear entirely. I tried to take the high road initially, believing that justice would come through proper legal channels. The morning after discovering the full extent of Troy's theft, I called the best divorce attorney in Phoenix and laid out my case with military precision. I had documentation, financial records, and a clear paper trail showing systematic fraud. It should have been an open and shut case. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Walsh," Attorney Jennifer Hayes said during our consultation. But the reality is that spousal financial misconduct cases are incredibly difficult to prosecute, especially when the assets were technically joint property. Joint property that he moved without my knowledge or consent while I was caring for my dying mother, I replied, my voice tight with controlled anger. Proving that level of deception will require extensive litigation, and even then, recovery is complicated when the funds have been spent overseas. We're looking at years of legal battles with no guarantee of success. The consultation fee alone was $500, and she estimated the total legal costs could reach $50,000 or more. Meanwhile, Troy and Bethany were posting daily updates from their Hawaiian paradise, my mother's inheritance funding their romantic dinners and couples massages. Desperate for alternatives, I filed a police report for theft, but Detective Rodriguez was equally discouraging. Look, Mrs. Walsh, I sympathize with your situation, but technically, your husband had legal access to these accounts. The district attorney won't pursue charges in what appears to be a civil matter. Civil matter? I repeated incredulously. He forged my signature on loan documents. Can you prove the signatures were forged? Because his lawyer will argue you gave him permission to handle finances while you were dealing with family issues. That evening, I called my brother Michael in Seattle, hoping for emotional support if nothing else. Instead, I got another devastating blow. Karen, I don't know how to tell you this, he said, his voice heavy with reluctance. Troy called me yesterday. He said you've been having some kind of breakdown since Mom died, that you've been making wild accusations about money. He seemed really worried about you. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. Troy wasn't just stealing my money. He was stealing my credibility, painting me as an unstable woman, having a grief-induced psychotic break. By the time I could prove the theft, my reputation would be destroyed, and his narrative would be firmly established. Michael, you know me. Do I sound unstable to you? I asked, fighting to keep my voice steady. You sound angry, he admitted. Look, maybe you should focus on healing instead of fighting. Troy said he'd be willing to work out some kind of settlement if you stopped pursuing legal action. A settlement? Troy wanted to negotiate returning a fraction of what he stole in exchange for my silence and compliance. The audacity was staggering, but also enlightening. He was worried enough about legal exposure to preemptively discredit me with my own family. That night, I received another text from Troy. Saw you filed a police report. That was unnecessary drama, Karen. I'm willing to discuss a reasonable settlement when we get back from our honeymoon. No need to make this uglier than it needs to be. Attached was another photo of him and Bethany at an expensive restaurant, her engagement ring sparkling in the candlelight as they shared what looked like $1,000 meal. The casual dismissal of my grief and outrage as unnecessary drama was the final straw. I stared at that photo for a long time, studying their faces. They looked so confident, so secure in their victory. Troy's expression held a hint of smug satisfaction, as if he were savoring not just the expensive wine, but the knowledge that he had completely outmaneuvered his ex-wife. He thought he had won. He thought his careful planning and legal maneuvering had made him untouchable. But Troy had forgotten that I wasn't just some abandoned wife crying into her tissues. I was a cybersecurity specialist with 25 years of experience in digital warfare. And if the legal system wouldn't give me justice, I would create my own. The breakthrough came when I was analyzing Troy's digital footprint more carefully, searching for any vulnerability I could exploit. What I discovered made me realize that my husband's arrogance extended far beyond his personal betrayal. He had been running his business with the same reckless disregard for security that he'd shown in stealing from me. Mitchell & Associates wasn't just Troy's consulting firm. It was a carefully constructed house of cards, built on fraudulent practices that would make my inheritance theft look like petty larceny. Using techniques I'd developed for penetration testing at Velwyn Digital, I gained access to his business servers and uncovered a systematic pattern of client fraud spanning nearly 5 years. Troy had been double-billing clients, creating fake expenses for projects that didn't exist, and most damaging of all, selling confidential client information to their competitors. The financial records showed millions of dollars in illicit revenue, all carefully hidden through shell companies and offshore accounts. The inheritance money wasn't funding a romantic honeymoon. It was helping to hide evidence of massive corporate fraud. But the most shocking discovery was that Bethany wasn't just his secretary and mistress. She was his partner in crime. Email chains showed her actively participating in the fraudulent schemes, forging documents, and coordinating with overseas contacts to launder money. Their Hawaiian honeymoon was actually a business trip to finalize the transfer of stolen funds to accounts in countries with strict banking privacy laws. As I dug deeper, I realized that Troy's betrayal of me was part of a larger exit strategy. He had been planning to disappear with Bethany and their stolen millions, leaving behind a trail of devastated clients and a wife who would be legally responsible for any business debts or criminal liability. My name was still on several of his business documents as the emergency contact and partial guarantor. The scope of their criminal enterprise was breathtaking, but it also presented an opportunity I hadn't expected. If I could expose their fraud to the right authorities, I wouldn't just recover my inheritance, I could destroy them completely. However, there was a problem. The evidence I'd gathered was obtained through methods that weren't exactly legal. Any prosecutor would throw out my findings due to how I'd acquired them, and I could face criminal charges for unauthorized computer access. I needed a way to expose their crimes without revealing my own illegal investigation. That's when I remembered the virus. 3 years earlier, I had developed a sophisticated piece of malware for a government contract, a program designed to infiltrate foreign systems and gather intelligence while appearing to be a routine software update. The project had been classified, and I'd been required to turn over all copies to federal authorities. But I had kept one backup copy on an encrypted drive, telling myself it was for academic research purposes. The virus was elegant in its simplicity. Once activated, it would systematically copy all files from infected computers and transmit them to a secure server, while simultaneously creating fake system logs to cover its tracks. More importantly, it could be programmed to trigger automatically when certain conditions were met, like when the infected computers connected to specific international banking networks. I spent the next 2 days modifying the code, creating a version that would activate when Troy's laptop accessed his offshore accounts. The beauty of the plan was that the virus would make it appear as though his own criminal activity had exposed him. The same security vulnerabilities he'd created through his fraud would be his downfall. All I needed was a way to install it on his computer remotely. Fortunately, Troy's arrogance had given me the perfect opening. He was still using the same email address and passwords he'd used throughout our marriage, never bothering to change them after our separation. The final piece of my plan required patience and perfect timing. I knew from their social media posts that Troy and Bethany would be returning to Phoenix in 3 days, and Troy would immediately need to access his business accounts to manage the legitimate portions of his consulting firm. That would be my moment to strike. But as I prepared to execute my plan, an unexpected complication arose. My phone rang at 2 a.m., displaying a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, a woman's voice spoke in rapid, panicked sentences. "Is this Karen Walsh? You don't know me, but my name is Patricia Lewis. I'm a client of your husband's firm, and I think you need to know what he's done to us." Patricia's story was heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. She was a widow in her 70s who had hired Troy to manage her late husband's retirement investments. Over the past 2 years, he had systematically drained her accounts, claiming the money was being invested in high-yield overseas opportunities. She had only discovered the truth when she tried to withdraw funds for medical expenses and found her accounts nearly empty. "I called the police, but they said it was a civil matter," she said, her voice breaking. "He stole my husband's life insurance money, everything we worked for. I don't know what to do." "How did you get my number?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I hired a private investigator. He found out about your situation and said there might be other victims. There are at least 6 of us that we know about, all elderly clients he's been stealing from. We can't afford lawyers, and the police won't help." The conversation lasted over an hour, and by the end, I realized that my personal revenge had become something much larger. Troy wasn't just a cheating husband who had stolen my inheritance. He was a predator, targeting vulnerable seniors, destroying the financial security of people who couldn't fight back. Patricia gave me contact information for the other victims, and over the next day, I spoke with each of them. The pattern was always the same. Troy would gain their trust, convince them to consolidate their investments with his firm, then systematically loot their accounts while providing fake statements showing fictional gains. The total theft exceeded $4 million, money stolen from people who had worked their entire lives to build modest nest eggs for their retirement years. Some of them were now facing eviction or couldn't afford necessary medications because of Troy's greed. As I listened to their stories, my anger transformed into something colder and more focused. This wasn't about personal betrayal anymore. It was about justice for people who had no other recourse. The legal system had failed them just as it had failed me, but I had capabilities they didn't possess. I modified my virus one final time, programming it not just to expose Troy's crimes, but to systematically reverse his fraudulent transactions. The offshore accounts he'd worked so hard to hide would become the mechanism of his downfall, automatically transferring the stolen money back to his victims while simultaneously alerting federal authorities to his location and activities. The beauty of the plan was its poetic justice. Troy had used his victims' trust against them, exploiting their faith in his expertise. Now his own arrogance and technological ignorance would be his undoing. He thought he was safe in his Hawaiian paradise, but he had no idea that his next login would trigger a digital earthquake that would destroy everything he'd built. As I finalized the code, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since my mother's death. Troy had made the mistake of targeting not just me, but innocent people who deserved better. He was about to learn that some fights choose you, and some enemies you simply cannot afford to make. Troy's return to Phoenix was announced with typical arrogance. A social media post showing him and Bethany at the airport, tan and relaxed, with the caption, "Back to reality, but what amazing memories we made with the money we earned." The casual cruelty of that word choice, earned, made my finger hover over the activation key for the virus. I waited until exactly 9 a.m. on Monday morning, knowing Troy's habits well enough to predict when he'd check his business accounts. My laptop showed 3 screens, one monitoring his network activity, one tracking the offshore accounts, and one displaying the FBI's financial crimes tip line, which I had already contacted with an anonymous report about suspicious international transfers from Mitchell and Associates. At 9:17 a.m., Troy's laptop connected to the First International Bank of Cayman Islands. The virus activated instantly. Within minutes, the malware had copied every file on his computer and begun systematically reversing the fraudulent transfers that had devastated his elderly clients. Patricia Lewis's stolen retirement fund was the first to be restored, followed by the other victims in order of their financial desperation. The virus worked silently and efficiently, using Troy's own access codes and authentication to make the transfers appear legitimate. But the real masterstroke was what happened next. The virus simultaneously triggered automated fraud alerts across multiple international banking networks, flagging the sudden movement of millions of dollars as suspicious activity. Within 30 minutes of Troy's login, federal investigators were receiving real-time notifications about potential money laundering operations traced to his business. My phone buzzed with a text from Troy. "Something's wrong with my computer. All my files are corrupted. Do you know any tech support people?" The irony was delicious. He was asking his cybersecurity expert ex-wife to help him fix the very system I had just compromised. I replied, "Have you tried turning it off and on again?" 20 minutes later, another text. "This is serious, Karen. Someone's hacked my accounts. I need professional help." "That does sound serious," I responded. "Maybe you should call the police." The dominoes fell faster than I had anticipated. By noon, Patricia called me in tears, not of sorrow this time, but of relief. "Karen, I don't understand what happened, but my money is back," she sobbed into the phone. "All of it. It just appeared in my account this morning with a note saying the bank had discovered fraudulent activity and reversed the transactions. Similar calls came from the other victims throughout the day. Elderly clients who had been facing financial ruin were suddenly whole again, their stolen retirement funds mysteriously restored. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was reportedly following several promising leads in what they described as a sophisticated international fraud scheme. Meanwhile, Troy's texts grew increasingly frantic. "The FBI is at my office," he wrote at 3 p.m. "They're seizing everything. This is insane. Someone set me up." I replied, "That's terrible. I hope you have a good lawyer. They're saying I stole millions from clients. That's impossible. The money was in legitimate offshore investments." "Offshore investments?" I texted back. "That sounds complicated. Maybe you should have been more careful about your digital security." The news broke that evening. Local media ran the story with the headline, "Phoenix business owner arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme." Troy's mugshot showed a man who looked nothing like the confident figure from the Hawaiian beach photos. His face was pale and confused, his expression that of someone who genuinely couldn't understand how his carefully constructed world had collapsed so completely. Bethany was arrested the next morning at Sky Harbor Airport, apparently attempting to board a flight to Brazil with a suitcase full of cash and jewelry. Her Instagram account, which had been documenting their luxurious honeymoon just days earlier, was suddenly filled with panicked posts claiming innocence and blaming Troy for manipulating her. The final text I received from Troy came from the county jail. "I know this was you somehow. You destroyed me." I replied, "I'm just a grieving widow who lost her inheritance." What could I possibly have done? The federal investigation revealed the full scope of Troy and Bethany's criminal enterprise within weeks. Prosecutors found evidence of fraud totaling over $4 million, tax evasion, money laundering, and identity theft. The sophisticated nature of their offshore banking network suggested connections to organized crime, which elevated the charges to federal racketeering violations. Troy was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while Bethany received 8 years after agreeing to testify against him. Their assets were seized and liquidated, with the proceeds distributed among their victims. The Hawaiian resort they had planned to purchase was sold at auction, with the proceeds going toward restitution payments. Most satisfying was learning that their elaborate wedding, funded with stolen money, had been annulled when Bethany's testimony revealed she had been married to someone else throughout their entire relationship. Troy's dream of a new life with his young bride had been built on lies from the very beginning. As I sat in my small apartment 1 year later, now financially secure with my inheritance restored and additional compensation from the victims' fund, I reflected on the strange justice of it all. Troy had taught me something valuable about the nature of revenge. Sometimes the most devastating punishment comes from simply allowing people to face the consequences of their own choices. The virus had merely accelerated the inevitable collapse of a criminal enterprise built on greed and arrogance. My mother would have been proud to know her inheritance had ultimately helped restore the retirement savings of 6 elderly victims, and that her daughter had found a way to transform personal betrayal into a force for justice.